Okay, I will open the session first. Okay, dear distinguished guests and participants, welcome to the fourth lecture of our guest lecture series 2021. This guest lecture is part of the collaboration between the School of Architecture, Planning and Policy Development, or SIPPD-ITB, and the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning, or ABP, the University of Melbourne. Firstly, I would like to greet our honorable speaker, Professor Julie Willis. She's also the Dean of ABP UoM. Thank you so much for making time to join us here, Julie. And also, I would like to say hi to the Dean of SIPPD-ITB, Ibu Sri Mariati, and also the Vice Dean for Academic Affairs, Bapak Aswin Indra Pasta. Thank you for joining us here. And also, the moderator for today's lecture is Ibu Indah Widyastuti. Hi. And thank you all so much for making time with us here, especially Julie, who is willing to share her expertise in gender and architect design and profession. Before we start, I would like to remind all the participants that if you have any questions during the lecture, please feel free to put it in the chat box. The moderator will read it in the question and answer session. So without further ado, I will hand over this lecture to the moderator, Ibu Indah. Please, time is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Ibu Roro, for your kind introductions. Welcome to Professor Julie Willis. Hi. We are pleased to have your kind presence here among us to share the knowledge with us and students also. And also welcome students and faculty of the School of Architecture, Planning and Policy Development, ITB. We are meeting again in these occasions and guest lecture series in 2021. Okay.
Hello.
Hello. Yes. Oh, okay.
Ya, kenapa Pak? Mama tadi lagi makan, HP-nya lagi di charge.
Gita Saraswati, could you mute your?
Udah.
Sorry for the disturbance. Okay. Yeah. So, we are meeting again in these occasions of the guest lecture series 2021, and we know that this lecture is particularly compulsory for students of the final studio in undergraduate study program. And for the postgraduate students, it is compulsory for students of the World Contemporary Architecture course, research studio, and design studio thesis. So kindly be attentive and engage with the discussions. Okay, today Professor Julie Willis will address a topic, equity and diversity in architectures, women, work, and leadership. Oh, is there? Okay. Okay. So with this topic, Professor Julie Willis will discuss about the positions of women in contemporary architectural practice. She put some points of discussions here, such as what hurdle that women face in entering the professional world. Is there still any discriminations and unequal access to architectural educations and job, including promotion and salary? Does gender equity exist in our architectural academic and praxis? So that is the topics that we are going to discuss today. And before we start, now let me introduce a brief profile of Professor Julie Willis. Professor Julie Willis is a Redmond Berry Distinguished Professor of Architecture and Dean of the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning at the University of Melbourne, Australia. She also holds an honorary Professor of Architecture positions at ITB. Her research concentrates on the history of architecture with a focus on institutional building and profession, as well as the contemporary issues including equity and diversity in the Australian architectural professions and design for health and well-being in hospital settings. Okay, audience, we will start the lecture. Professor Julie Willis, time is yours now, please.
Thank you so much, Ibu Indah. So, first of all, selamat siang. It's very nice to be here.
Selamat siang.
I'm going to give a lecture in two parts today. I'm first going to highlight some statistics numbers about women and men working in the profession in architecture. And my apologies, because these are Australian statistics, but I think they are useful to understand the issues around equity and diversity in the architecture profession. The work comes from a project that was completed some time ago, funded by the Australian Research Council in their linkage project scheme, and I was part of the research team. And you can see my colleagues here lined up. We undertook considerably, well, an important project, because it was one of the first times that we had systematically looked at gender equity in the profession, and it was supported by the Australian Institute of Architects. From that project came the activist group Parla, which is based in Melbourne, and I am a founding member of it. And it shapes a lot of the work that we do today. And many of the statistics that I bring to you today come from the work of Parla as a collective. So in Australia over time, and you can see the records here going back to 1924, the number of women participating in the profession of architecture has grown over time. And in particular, it has grown rapidly in the last 20 to 25 years. I compiled the statistics for the early part of this work up until about 1994 on this graph. And at that stage, when I compiled them in 1997, I predicted that women would meet about 50% of the profession by about 2015. That has not occurred, and there are reasons why that has not occurred, and I will be unpacking some of those reasons in my presentation today. Now, one of the difficulties in looking at numbers of architects, particularly in Australia, is that they are counted in different ways, and perhaps it is the same in Indonesia. We can count an architect by being a registered architect, somebody who has passed all the professional exams and is registered under statutory protection in Australia. And that's what the statistics on the left-hand side say. But I myself am not a registered architect in Australia. I am a graduate of architecture, a professor of architecture, but not a registered architect. I am not counted in those statistics. So we are also using the Australian census data to tell us something about those who identify as architects in the census that does not require passing or listing on a statutory register. And we can see here, if we look on the right-hand side, that the corresponding numbers of those who identify as architects are, in fact, in the case of women, much higher than they are amongst the registered architects. I want to introduce to you a couple of concepts today, and they are important for understanding what is going on. And certainly with Iburo's help, I have tried to provide a translation. The translations may not be very useful, but I wanted to at least try to give an idea of them to a wide audience. So the first concept is this dilution effect. We know in Australia, women architects have been entering the profession in larger numbers for decades. They have formed approximately 50% of the students graduating from degree courses in Australia for at least 20 years, if not 25 years. But when they enter the whole profession, as there is a larger population of male architects overall, women architects still form the minority. So we might start well with education, but by the time we get to the profession, there seem to be fewer women architects. The good news in Australia is that the increase is across the board in the way women are participating in the profession. And I will take from left to right. Of the registered women architects, over the last 20 years, we have seen a doubling of the percentage of women registered as architects. And it is increasing. The admissions to registers, you can see in 2016 standing at 40%, which is very close to the percentage of graduates. But of all architects, 31%, not growing quite at the same rate. And as we look at it in more detail, we see that women are more likely to be an employee of an architecture firm rather than the owner of a firm, a partner, incorporated or unincorporated. So this looks like good news, but let's look at it in more detail. This makes a comparison of the number of architects versus those who identify as landscape architects. And we can see in landscape architecture that the percentage of male and females participating is around about 50%, somewhere between 40 and 60%, but fairly close. And the numbers decline at the older age groups of landscape architects. This is not the case in architecture. What we can see is that it starts as reasonably close, and then the number of women drop away quite dramatically. And while we see a decline in the number of male architects in those different age groups, the decline is not nearly so dramatic. Now, part of that change in age profile is simply the number of graduates who have been joining the profession. So there are more young graduates than there are older graduates. It's not necessarily an indication of people leaving the profession, although that happens as well. But the story is more complicated. As we look at those who are working full-time versus those who are working part-time, we see a dramatic difference. For architects, we see that at the early stage, just immediate post-graduation, where someone is in that in their late 20s, the participation is mostly full-time. Then it drops off quite dramatically, and the number of part-time employees who are female rises correspondingly at that time. There is only a very small proportion of male employees who are part-time, and that is consistent across the age groups, except as they approach retirement. A similar story in landscape architecture, you can see there, where part-time work is almost exclusively the province of women. Now, we can answer this quite quickly. The rise in part-time work corresponds with the main period of time in which women may be having children, and so they make choices based on that. And in Australia, it is very common for a woman to go part-time when they have children or take time out of their work for a number of years. When we see this represented a different way, you can see I'm now having the census data and the graduate data coming together, that we see a good correlation between the percentage of graduates and the percentage of architects in the 25 to 29 age group, and that diminishes over time. It suggests an attrition out of the profession. When we see the owners of incorporated businesses, this is a smaller percentage. This is, we're seeing smaller and smaller percentages as I go on. And when we add part-time work, we see that there is this wider group of people sitting around as part of the architecture profession, but they are not the leaders of the profession. Those who are owning their own practices, those who have the greatest voice and the greatest fan clubs, I think might be the way to describe it. They are the most prominent, those who own their own businesses in the architecture profession. And when we see those who are high earners put on this, and we've used the percentage of those who earn over a certain amount in Australia as the high earner categorisation as defined by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, we can see there are even fewer who are women. So what is happening here? I'm going to introduce to you another concept, and this one was tricky to translate. We would call it the leaky pipeline. Whether I have a good translation, I don't know. But what that means is that large numbers of people enter at the start of a career. But over time, as years go by, only smaller numbers are retained in that profession. And slowly, and particularly for women, and particularly in architecture, they leak away over time. In other words, there is attrition that goes on. And it's the reason why we haven't seen women forming a larger proportion of the profession as they should have, given their graduation numbers. And we can see this shown quite dramatically here. Again, this uses the census data. And if you look here on the right, you can see the different years of the census. And I can't give you 2021 because the Australian Bureau of Statistics hasn't released the data yet. But it shows the cohorts and as they progress over time. So if we look at this cohort here marked at H, we can see that in 2001, they were in the 45 to 49 age group, then in the 50 to 54 in the next census period, and so on. What it shows us is the dramatic change in the numbers participating in architecture, the number of women, between graduation and in the next 5 to 10 years. And this is consistent across the cohorts, but by the time they reach their late 30s, the numbers have stabilised and there is only minimal attrition after that period of time. So if women are going to leave the profession, they're going to do it before they are 35. And this is, it is clear that they do that for a whole series of reasons. So if we look at something like working the number of hours worked in architecture, and architecture is known for having a hard working culture that can work very long hours, we see the difference as it affects men and women. When young graduates start, they are working approximately the same number of hours, normal working weeks without a big proportion of part-time. But as we go into the crucial 30 to 34 and 35 to 39 age groups, we see the male's capacity to work longer hours is increased and the women's stays the same. And in fact, it reduces when with rising levels of part-time work in the late 30s and men's increasing hours continue right up to their peak working age in their late 50s. Women's change only marginally during that period of time. Women, for whatever reason, are not able to work long hours. Not that long hours are desirable, but it will have a limiting effect on their career progression. We have also looked at the pay gap, that is the difference between what a male and a female is paid for exactly the same work. There is a difference evident at graduation, and this starts to change very quickly over time, where women are earning consistently less than their male colleagues over time. So not only are they not able to participate as well in the architecture profession, they are being paid less for it than their male counterparts over time. In other words, it's a less attractive proposition for them. And I've shown a little bit of this data before. Architects, male and female, start out as employees, and generally over time, they will start businesses. And we do see that the engagement is somewhat equal over time. It's improving where more women are engaged in as owners, but what's interesting about this is that they perhaps start to retire earlier than their male counterparts. And we see this when we look at data shown in a different way. Only a small proportion of women are owners of businesses, a higher proportion of men. And we also see that in terms of registration versus unregistered architects in Australia, that the women are registering in the same proportion as they were in 2011 as they are in 2016, but there's a larger proportion of unregistered women during this period of time, and the men stay more or less the same. This is quite a complicated slide to read. I don't expect you to be able to read it all in one go, even though I like it as a slide. It tells us both good news and bad news. It says that graduates, female graduates, sitting at 40%, but there is attrition over time as they become a graduate architect, and this is a membership of the Institute of Architects, an affiliate. Their registration drops off quite considerably. Fellow of the Institute is very small numbers that might go on to the highest accolades of national president and gold medalists. We have a significant proportion who are not practicing. Employees is a high proportion, sole practitioner, and so director, partner, sole practitioner form a small part compared to the employees. And this is in contrast to the male proportions that we're talking about. So what does this mean? So women are more likely to work part-time. They're more likely to not be able to work unpaid overtime. They earn less money, and as a result, they can be overlooked for promotions and partnership, and therefore being prominent. They then look for roles that fit their lives better. So they may go into a different form of practice. They may join government. They may go into an area which takes architectural skills but isn't about architectural profession, or they leave the profession entirely. It's the leaky pipeline in play. So as a group, what have we learned about making change? And I've got a number of lessons through this. Well, first of all, data is important. It's not enough just to have data, but it tells us something about what is happening in the profession and where we need to work differently. So data can be used in lots of different ways, but I want to draw your eyes to the last point here. How can data help build longitudinal knowledge, that is knowledge over time, about the institution, the discipline, and the profession? And the institution may be an educational institution, it may be a government institution, it may be a practice. But how do we understand what is happening over time in terms of gender equity? So data tells us where problems may lie, but it doesn't tell us everything. We think that grassroots action, building new communities to understand what is going on, is very important. And as a result of starting Parlour, which is a site for exchange and discussion. You can see it has its aims there as activists and advocates, as researchers and scholars, as women active in Australian architecture. And it has been very successful. This gives you an idea of the traffic that the Parla website has generated. And I'm pleased to see that also in Indonesia, some traffic, but very much focused in Australia and New Zealand, which is not surprising given the focus of the group. And you can see this, talk and action is an important part of Parla working together. And these are some of the workshops that we have held to try and push the profession along to change its approach. So it's important to understand if communities already exist to support things like gender equity, and how can they be supported and strengthened? Is it possible to initiate new groups? And are there demographic cohorts such as young practitioners that could be connected? How can research contribute to these communities and then be activated by them? And how can different media and institutional frameworks support previously invisible groups to take action? Because it's important to show diverse stories. To our students, it is important to see people like them being successful, doing things that combine life and work. And so seeing people in action in the profession at all different stages of life and experience is important. The fact that women and men have children is an important thing to recognise in work-life balance. The fact that women may be pregnant, the fact that women may lead things, to go on site, to be to participate fully in the profession of architecture and not in some particular roles. To show that success to a broad audience, to see people engaged, and not to put up with the statement that I have had many times where I am told that there are no good women candidates, and that's why we have to have an all-male jury or an all-male shortlist for a job. Parla started what we term Marion's List, named for the female architect Marion Marnie Griffin, who along with her husband Walter Burley Griffin was the designer of the Canberra Plan. Marion's List aims to provide qualified women to any jobs that are needed, any juries, any advice, and it means that there is no excuse for saying there's not a qualified woman. So it's important to think about how we represent organisations, institutions and professions visually. What stories does that tell and what messages are embedded? What does this convey about architecture as a discipline and as a profession? And how can this encourage underrepresented groups to study architecture and to support them to stay in the profession? We need to make space for many voices and to listen to those many voices. People come from all sorts of different perspectives, and we need to celebrate those and understand them as part of architecture, because that is, as professionals, that is who we are designing for, is the widest range of human conditions. We need to share stories and share experience so that we can understand where people have overcome difficulties, what new ideas they bring to the table, and where we might go in the future. But it is important to understand who is provided with platforms and spaces to speak, what experiences are given prominence in the development of initiatives, programs and policies. If everybody is exactly like you, then you will write a policy that is only applicable to yourselves. What voices do students, professionals, and leaders hear? And how can other voices and experiences be brought to the front? And what forums and spaces can best support new voices? We can use policies as a shared framework for action. And here I'm talking about policies that may not be government policies, but policies of professional organisations like institutes of architects or educational institutions. This is the gender equity policy of the Australian Institute of Architects, which was developed based on our work, and it adopts 10 principles to try and improve the equity of the profession in general, and in particular trying to promote the work of women and that they are an equal part of the profession. You can see here that they have slightly different things that they're trying to communicate, but importantly, it has promote equality of employment arrangements, support development of alternative and flexible career pathways in the profession, and educate the profession about the impact of gender stereotypes. So we should be asking if there are equity policies in place, and are those policies well known and easily accessible? Is there leadership from the top? And are other things needed? Because we need to put knowledge in the hands of others, and that's sharing knowledge and ideas to help people. So Parla put together the guides to equitable practice, and talking about, in the Australian context, a series of elements that were really important to improving gender equity in the profession. You can see there pay equity, long hours culture, part-time work, career progression, career breaks, leadership, mentoring. And each of these went through very carefully, what is the thing we're talking about here? Why does it matter? And what can we do? A practical guide for practices to change the way they work. I'm really pleased to say that the American Institute of Architects have been inspired and released their own guides to equitable practice based on Parla's work. Theirs are different because they are at a different position. Intercultural competence has been a really important part of their work, but they are based on the same idea that if you provide a framework and guidelines for the way in which practices can operate, they will be more able to operate more effectively and build a more equitable profession. It's also been very important to provide role models and to redress some of the imbalances of the past. One of the other pieces of work that we have done is to join in a worldwide project to put into the historical record through Wikipedia the work of women architects. And because Wikipedia has certain rules about what can qualify, a lot of work has gone on in the back to find out and to work within those rules so that the women architects can have a prominent part of sort of online understanding of our history. So sometimes there are relevant tools and guides that are already available. They may need to be adapted for the local context and what knowledge and voices need to be incorporated with them. Can they help to ensure that those involved understand equity issues? Well, I say that they can, and they can be used to increase the impact of work and research. They can actually communicate the experience, needs, and commitments of multiple groups. Of course, we don't want to reinvent the wheel. We want to build on the work of others, and where we can do that, we do. And here I'm drawing on the Workplace Gender Equality Agency in Australia of their toolkit to a gender equality roadmap. And what it lays out are the steps towards true gender equality. I'll go through each in turn. The first really is avoiding where the structural and cultural barriers to women's career progression are not recognised or they're denied that they exist. Exclusive or discriminatory behaviour towards women is accepted or normal, and there are no measures of reporting of gender representation or equality issues, and no one accepts or sees a need to accept accountability for gender equality or diversity. We then have the next step, which is compliance, where gender equity or diversity are seen as a compliance risk, not as important or an enabler to better things. And gender equality and diversity activity is limited to meeting compliance obligations. And in Australia, increasingly, we are seeing compliance requirements. In the state of Victoria, in which I'm located, the Victorian government has passed legislation that requires institutions to have a gender equity plan and to reach gender parity. And so we have a compliance issue that we need to now follow, and there are other compliance issues that we face. There's programmatic. There are programs provided, but they're in responses to issues that can't be ignored, like things that are against the law, or they are a public relations disaster if they appear. The actions are reactive, not planned and strategic. And the gender initiatives are disconnected and fragmented. And organisational priorities take precedence and displace gender equity action. I think this is where my university is right this moment, I have to say. And I chair the university's Diversity and Inclusion Committee, so I should know. I'm hoping we're moving towards the strategic, where a specific case for addressing gender equity or equality is identified and promoted by leaders, and the gender strategy is developed, which supports the organisation's strategy and objective, and it's used to guide effort, investment and specific initiatives, and is regularly reviewed. And then it should become integrated, where best practice is integrated into policies and processes. The case for gender equality is understood and embraced at all levels, and commitment to an investment in gender equality is not affected by challenges. And structural and cultural barriers to female career progression are actively challenged and addressed. Finally, sustainability, that gender equity is embedded in everything that is done. Everyone has the capability, confidence and commitment to build gender inclusive cultures. And gender equality is simply part of how business is done and how people work together, always. Of course, in doing this, you need to know your audience. That is, you need to be able to speak to them and to understand what they need to hear to have effective efforts, actions, and communication. Because the people who design the built environment should be as diverse a group as those who use it. Terima kasih. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Willis, for a very inspiring lectures. Okay, now we are entering for the sessions of questions and answer or discussions. I will invite first maybe 2 questions from the audience. Is there any Any questions from the audience? I forgot to say that actually you can also put your questions on chat room.
So maybe I can have the questions, Bu Indah?
Yeah, sure, Bu Hima. Please.
Thank you, Julie. It's a very inspiring talk. So my first question is, do you indicate that during the education, there is already a different feeling or a different situation where the inequity between the female and male student is already taking place? Do you think from the start of, from the beginning of the education, actually it did already happen, the inequity, consciously or unconsciously maybe? So that, yeah.
The feedback from our students is that no, they don't feel that. And when we try to speak to them about the inequities of professional life, they do not believe us. And then they go to work and they come back and say, why did you not tell me? So we think that at least in my school, that they do not feel that there is a gender inequality. However, we still don't have 50% female academics and 50% male academics. So they're more likely to see a male teaching them than a female, but they don't perceive it to be a difference. But when they reach the profession, they see the difference. It's very, very obvious to them because they are told things that are discriminatory straight to their face.
So when did it start actually that people differentiate the response to the male or female architect? When did it happen actually? When during the education we don't see any differences, and then suddenly we realize that we are treated differently. So when did it start actually?
Well, I think in the profession, women have always been treated differently. So my work on the history of women in architecture tells me that women have been treated differently since they started. But it's surprising to me that it still happens. But it's questions like, when are you going to have children? I'm not going to invest in you if you are going to leave when you have children. Now, that is against the law in Australia because it's discriminatory, but it's still being said to our female graduates. There are comments about the suitability of going on site. Sorry, my dog might bark. Apologies, someone has just rung our doorbell. So whether women are capable of going on a site or climbing a ladder is still asked. When I was a student, and this is a long time ago, when we were taken on site, women were given different tasks to men because the assumption was the women couldn't manage power tools. I can manage a power tool, and I have since I was a child because my father taught me. But these are the kinds of things that are being still happening, and they have happened over a long period of time.
And do you think the society or the community around us or around the profession of architecture plays also a role to differentiate between the, and in what sense mostly happening, that this differentiation, for example?
Well, I can only speak for Australia and my experience, but there is an underlying assumption that men are good at building things and women are good at decorating things. And so that the assumption is that the women will do the interiors and the men will do the exteriors, and that women cannot build. So those are some of the assumptions. We see that in the toys that children are given, that the male children are given trucks and tools, and the female are given dolls and kitchen equipment and brushes, you know, things for cleaning the house.
Yeah, because in our traditional society, the women mostly do the building. For example, the Balinese ladies, they do the hard work part of the building.
That's good.
And the matriarchat society, for example, the women has the right or has the voice to organize all of the families and all of the communities. So that's why the society, or in our traditional society, maybe we don't see any big difference between the male and the female, because each one has its own role, how to
Yes.
play or how to work in the society. Yeah,
Yes.
maybe that's the difference, because when we are raised up in the traditional society, then we don't see any differences. But when we enter the modern society, then we see directly the commercial products, for example, when we for the toys or for the garments or for the fashions, for example, you come directly to the shops, the male part and the female part, and so on. So that makes us realize that we have a different life or different world between male and female, for example. Okay, thank you for the discussion.
Thank you.
Linda.
Thank you, Ibu Roro. Thank you, Ibu Hima. Okay, there are two questions here from Ibu Roro first. So here's the questions. We have many emerging. Ibu Roro, maybe if you want,
Okay.
you can also address your questions.
Okay.
Directly.
Thank you, Julie. I have a question actually. This is based on my interview with some of the women organizations in Indonesia. So we actually have emerging women's association or groups in Indonesia, particularly in architecture. Yet as an organization, they are not connected to each other. So they work alone, something like that. As a result, we have not seen any significant movement happening here to strive for gender equity in the profession. And mostly their movement are still in a stage of spreading the word and educating people about gender equity. So what I want to ask, what is actually the next step that they have to do in terms of making this movement a real movement instead of just, you know, like a rhetoric campaign? And how do we push it to the decision makers so that the policies that you mentioned before can, you know, be nice to women who have many cycles in their lives? I think that's my question. Thank you, Julie.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yes, yes.
It is very helpful when these groups start to communicate together, and that is because there is strength in numbers and there are shared experiences. So when you are working alone, you only have your own experience. When you come in a community, you realize that other people have the same experiences or similar experiences to you, and you are not alone. You become stronger in your voice, but you also realize what inequities are happening to many people, not just one person. So the shared experience is very important. Mobilizing, coming together to talk and to decide actions is very important. We have had the most success by talking with the institutions that we wish to change and asking them to work with us to facilitate that change. It has also helped in Australia that we have had a number of presidents of the Institute of Architects and the chapters in the individual states who have been women, who have been very passionate about this, and they have helped change the institutions from inside as well as us from outside. And so it has been a concerted effort to come together, to talk, to decide actions, to find ways of affecting change, to bring people to the cause. We have also talked with many men as well who find that some of the things we are talking about, they are finding useful and interesting as well, particularly about career flexibility, working fewer hours, having more time with family. That has been more important to younger generations of architects, male and female, than perhaps the older generations. So coming together and joining up the efforts, raising awareness is very important, but action needs to follow, and how moving it towards action is very important.
Thank you so much for your answer, Julie.
Thank you, Ibu Roro. Next is from Professor Iwan Sudrajat. Mas Denny, okay. So this is the questions.
Yeah, just based on the text, I read that.
So let me read the questions. There is an interesting phenomenon in Indonesia. Many eminent women architects were initially entered into the professional practice in partnership with their husbands. Not very sure whether they would be able to outlive without the patronage of their husbands. What do you think of such patronage or partnerships in terms of gender equity? Why there is no room for women architects to achieve successful careers independently? Interesting. Please.
This was a phenomenon that was very common in Australia, particularly from World War II onwards, so 1945 onwards. And I know many successful husband and wife architecture teams that come from that period of time. They did that so that they could manage having a family as well as running a practice. And so that it's a model of practice that was very successful for that period of time. We see it perhaps less commonly in Australia now. I can't answer whether it is the male or the female who is the most dominant partner in those practices. But we are now seeing in Australia significant practices that are being headed by women and not in partnership with their husband, in partnership with other people. And they are running successful practices as them as the only significant partner of the practice. So I think particularly of, say, Kirsten Thompson and her very successful firm, Kirsten Thompson Architects. So I do see the husband-wife practice as one model of practice. It is difficult to separate when you have two people contributing to a firm as to whether one will survive without the other. But some of them work quite independently. I think of the firm of Edmund Corrigan in Australia, which is Maggie Edmund, Peter Corrigan. Peter Corrigan passed away a number of years ago. Maggie Corrigan still practices. She's still very well known for what she does. She's still celebrated for what she does. And so we can see one outliving the other. There are other examples where the husband has outlived the female, but I see it as a model of practice, and it's not the only model of practice that is available.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Next question. Wait, was the questions from Pak Iwan or Ibu Tutin? Is it the last questions?
Tutin.
Oh, Ibu Tutin, ya. Okay. Yes. Okay, Ibu Tutin. Okay, this is Ibu Tutin. Is Ibu Tutin there? maybe you want to address the questions directly? Hello, Ibu Tutin.
Hi. Hello, Julie. Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. Yeah, actually, I have two
Oh,
comments.
okay, same questions.
Okay, so I conducted a very preliminary research on women architects in Indonesia, and I think there are some, in addition to the professional world itself, that is not women friendly. It's also the Indonesian Association of Architects that should be, I think we have to raise awareness, generate awareness among architects and also the association about what is the importance of bringing women into the profession. And I think I also found that women who survived in the profession, they usually work with their husband. Maybe this is similar to what Professor Iwan already mentioned earlier. And Roro also mentioned in the comments that there have been some associations, Women's Architect Association, for example, the Ibu Architects, and also Perempuan Arsitektur ya, Roro ya, Perempuan Arsitektur in Indonesia. I talked earlier with some of them, and I think the perspective on gender equality in the profession needs to be, I think we need to work more on that. So it's not only about they have already the awareness that, but they mostly work on more technical issues. So for example, preparing women how to enter the job market, preparing women how to compete with men, but not the very substantial issues in the architectural profession itself. Thank you. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you so much. I think that certainly if there is some, how do I put this? If the only model of practice for women architects is to be seen to work with a husband as an architect, then that's only there. It's a very narrow field of how success can be achieved in architecture. So while it might be historically, and that's the way there have been successful practices, it's good to celebrate that, but it's also important to celebrate other forms of practice as well. And women will be practicing in lots of different ways. So bringing forth other stories is useful if it is possible to do that. So I'm just, sorry, the other part of your question was about the groups coming together and what they could be doing. It's good to hear that they are supporting women into practice and encouraging them and setting them up for success. But it's also important to educate women in case there are instances of things happening to them that are not good, where they are not being treated the same as their male colleagues, such as in the pay structures or salary structures, to find out and support them when they have to speak to their employer and say that these conditions are not good enough. There are steps that can be taken to make the conversation more mature over time about supporting equality in the profession.
Okay.
Thank you, Julie.
Is it okay? Okay, Ibu Tutin. Professor Julie, I also want to ask just one. In ITB, for instance, the percentage of women entering the architectural programs are has been increasing, and it's increasing right now. But I don't know, maybe Ibu Ririn can may say how many of those female graduates who enter the professions. But firstly, I want to know about in Australia. What is the percentage? How much is the percentage of they enter the architectural studies and then going to professions, to architectural profession?
At the moment, the graduates of architecture who are women are about 46 to 48% of graduates. So they are nearly 50-50. I think in my faculty, it's more than 50% now.
Okay.
So it's heading towards 60%, but it will change year to year. And so they are entering the profession in good numbers, but they are not staying in the profession, which is our problem. And it's to do with those factors that I was talking about. Women deciding to have children, wanting to work part-time as they raise their children, but then long hours, inflexible work, difference in pay, and then deciding it's too hard. And so they start to leave the profession. And that is not good. That means that a lot of our talent is not continuing, but we are ending up with a less diverse profession. That means that we're not designing for all the people that we hope to serve. We're losing people who have valuable things to add to the discussion of design and how we house the whole population of our countries.
Yes. Okay, so it's 50-50 going to 60-40, isn't it, Professor Willis? Because in Indonesia, I think it was about 30% when I was students, as far as I remember. But now I think it is more than 60, more than 70%. So maybe Ibu Ririn, is it right? It's almost 2/3, yeah. Almost 2/3 of the students are female now, but I don't know what is the conditions in Indonesia. Maybe how many graduates come enter professional profession, architectural profession. That's what I have no data here. Maybe Ibu Ririn can share informations about it. But okay. Apparently, Ibu Ririn also addressed a questions here, so maybe it can be presented here. Ibu Ririn, are you going to address the question?
Yeah,
directly?
Thank you very, very much. Hello, Julie, how are you? I hope you enjoy this.
Thank you. Yes.
Okay. About the question from Ibu Indah about how many women are student in our faculty in architecture in ITB. Maybe 30 or 40 years ago, the percentage of the woman student maybe only 5% or 10%, Ibu Indah, I think.
Yes,
yeah.
okay. Yes.
Increasing.
My God.
And maybe 10 years ago, until 70% of the students are a woman. But actually, maybe a decrease in several years. I'm sorry, I don't have data, yeah, but it is. It's a good next research, Ibu Indah, to do.
Yes, I think because you could do research on that.
Yeah, that's right. And then in association in Indonesia, I think that the number of female architects who join the Ikatan Arsitek Indonesia or Architect Association in Indonesia is quite large. But I don't have defined
numbers. Yes,
numbers. Yeah, but on average, they are not do not reach a career as high as their male counterpart in the firm. So when I joined the association, and then also we have several that more women or architect women only in the mid-career of his as a compared to the male counterpart in consultant firm. Maybe I don't know, they have lots of obstacle in his life. I don't know. Yeah, maybe they married or maybe they have the children and something like that. But in this case, I want to ask you about how the condition of female architect in Australia in the dual role as a mother and also as an architect. Compared to a condition in Indonesia, in my observations, there are not many female architects who stand out in their career. Even though in Indonesia, their daily life is they have a helper such babysitters who taking care of their children, and also a helper to taking care of the household. How about the condition in Australia?
I think we have fewer helpers.
Oh,
I think the conditions in Australia, so if they have become easier in Australia because we now have much more organised childcare available. If we go back 50 years or more, there was very little by way of organised childcare. And so a woman who was a professional woman, who was a mother, had to make arrangements to have their children looked after or to work around the children's requirements. And so they might have a family member, a nanny, or all other organised childcare. Now, I am a mother of 3 children, and my children went to a childcare centre at the University of Melbourne, which meant I could be close to them during the day, and they are now very tall and they seem okay. It has become easier over time, but it is not easy to combine motherhood and a career, a very high performance career. And sometimes they come, they don't work well together. And that is where flexibility and understanding become very important. Today I have this, so I am the dean of a faculty. I have many meetings. My son cut his head at school. I had to go and collect him. I had to say to the people in the meeting, I need to go right now. If you do not feel as though you have power, you do not feel as though you can say, I have to leave now, I will come back, but this is more important. And I think for many women, it is difficult to have power to be able to say, I need flexibility now or tomorrow or next week. When you have an organisation that can cope with that flexibility, women feel empowered to use it. But they work very hard. It's not as though flexibility like that means that you will have people who don't do anything. On the contrary, they work very hard. But it has not been easy in Australia to combine professional careers and motherhood. It is getting easier over time. And we know that role models become very important to say, this person has done it, maybe I can do it too. It's one of the reasons that I actually talk about my children when I present, because it is important for people to understand that I have a career and I have managed my family responsibilities. They are very important to me and I do it flexibly. But if I can do it, you can do it too. And there are ways to do this. But women are very strong. They are very powerful. They are very inventive. They can do many things. This is why they should be equally good in architecture as their male counterparts.
Okay, Ibu Ririn, thank you very much.
I appreciate that.
Yes. Okay. Is there any more questions?
I actually have another question. If
Oh yes,
there's
yes.
no,
Ibu Roro. Please, please.
all right. Thank you so much. My question is more like probably this is a bit difficult to address. Because we're in Indonesia, we have this kind of like patriarchy culture, and not only the culture but also the religion that plays here. And we know that Indonesia is a very religious country. So some people put women below the men, and that what has happened in the earlier education, and now suddenly we want to change everything. That's gonna be a big deal and big effort to do. Do you think that we have to start like a bit slower and a bit earlier, probably in the education, that we kind of like sip in the agenda of, you know, this kind of equity idea? And I want to ask if MSD already like have that kind of, you know, agenda, or probably have certain subject probably that kind of like raising awareness of this problem. Thank you so much, Julie.
Thank you, Roro. It's a difficult question to answer because I think when I was a student, we did have subjects that talked about gender equity in architecture. And as students, we were very active in talking about this. It has become less prominent as it has over time, because women have felt equal in education. So they're more likely to feel equal in education than they are in the profession. But we do see in secondary school, women students choosing subjects that they think are more appropriate for women than men. So they don't choose mathematics and they don't choose physics. They choose biology, or they choose art because they see them as, or their parents see them as more appropriate to women. Now, I did physics and chemistry and maths, but my parents were scientists, so I didn't have a choice, and I enjoyed them. But perhaps I was the only female in my physics class when I was in secondary school. So we still see some of that happening in education, not so much at university, but in secondary school and even in primary school, where there is some gendering, unconscious gendering of education happening. It is worse in engineering than it is in architecture. And at least I know of a number of programs of women engineers now working with primary school students to try and encourage girls to think that robotics and other engineering things and computers are part of their future. And I think that's very important. Forgive me if I'm not, I worry that I'm going to make comments that I shouldn't be making here, but every country has its own cultures, its own traditions, its own religious upbringings, and all of those are strong parts of their culture that are important to be celebrated, understood. And that's why we have different countries in the world, because we have different ways of being, and that's fantastic. But at the same time, we need to, it is good for societies to have full participation of everyone, every part of society as much as possible. In my country, I have been brought up to believe that men and women can do almost anything. And it doesn't matter if they're male or female. It's about their brains, it's about their capacity, it's about their creativity, it's what they bring to it. And that is important. But there will be certain characteristics that I will bring as an individual to what I do, and another person brings different characteristics, and that difference is just as important as well. So what you want for a robust, sustainable profession, a sustainable society, is have lots of voices, not all the same voice. And that's where you get the best mix. It's like if you are breeding animals, if you only have a very limited gene pool, eventually weakness will come out in the animals that are produced. If you have a strong gene pool with lots of different genetic code in it, it will be stronger and more robust going forward. And so that's why I think that we need lots of voices, and we shouldn't be just saying only one group have the characteristics to be able to do this job, because then it's not good for the future for that to occur. I hope I haven't offended anybody in that answer.
No, not at all. Thank you so much for the answer.
Yes. Thank you, Ibu Roro, for the questions. Okay, now we have, okay, this is a questions from students, Frida. Okay, Frida, are you going to address the questions directly?
Yeah.
Hello,
Yes.
Sir Julie. I want to ask you, as we know together, the masculinity in this profession is strong as well. But apparently, the percentage of the students in the architecture stream is now dominated by women in several universities. As a beginner, especially student like me, like my friends, how can we start to decrease this masculinity stigma? Thank you.
Okay, please, Professor Willis.
Well, I do think that celebrating the contributions of women to the profession can show that the profession is not just a male occupation. And I am sure that there is a long history of women contributing to the design of the built environment in Indonesia that can be celebrated. And of course, in Bali, the women building is part of that tradition. And this is showing that women have had traditionally an important role in building, and that women have an important role, an increasingly important, bigger part of the profession now is important to understand. I found it very liberating when I was a student and I was looking for a PhD topic to study. And I was told that no one had done the history of women architects in Australia. And I went, I want to do that topic because I wanted to know about those who had come before me. And it was fascinating. And suddenly I realized that there were many had come, and 100 years before me studying architecture, and that they had been forgotten for various reasons. But by talking about them, more people would go, I can do this. I can be an architect, even though I might only see male architects being successful. There are women who have been successful. There are women who've done this, and I can do it too. And I will be part of the change for the profession for good.
Okay, thank you, Professor Willis. Oh, okay, there is one more questions. Okay, Rosie from Rosita Chika. Please, Rosita, okay. Where is the question? Rosita, are you going to address the question directly, please?
Okay, thank you, Bu.
Oh, I.
Maaf, Bu. So I want to ask about the
Oh.
I can see the question there.
is there any typology that and by a man, like as we know, like Zaha Hadid, the woman architect woman that we know, it has specialty of like parametric design. And how about architect in Australia? Is that any different design by the woman and the man? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosita. It is difficult to answer this question because most buildings are not designed by one person. They are designed by many people in firms. And it's very rare to find buildings that are only designed by women. This is not the case when you're a student, you have to design your building, but when you are in practice, many people contribute. So that is difficult to assign authorship of building to one person unless they are working by themselves. But I have not observed differences between the way women design and the way men design. Maybe that's because we receive the same education and we are exposed to the same or similar influences in our education, which we then take into practice. I think that there are, apologies, my dog has decided that somebody is coming home. Kevin.
It's okay. That's
My
part
dog,
of domestic life there.
Yes, my dog's name is Kevin and you can see him just there.
Hi, Kevin. Okay.
It is a popular thing I again don't know how to say this, but that women might design buildings that all curve and men design buildings that are all straight. But I have not seen this. I've seen both men and women design different buildings. And I think what we design from our own perspective. But as designers, as architects, we learn to understand the perspectives of our clients and design for them. And if we only design for our experience, we are not as good an architect if we can design for others' experience. I can't quite answer your question, Rosita. I am sorry, but not so much a difference from my point of view.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Rosita, for the questions. Okay. Yes, this is now Professor Iwan Sudrajat again. The question is, considering the percentage of females as well as male graduates who enter the professional practices is relatively small, would it be possible to broaden the learning outcomes of architecture study, covering on architecture study and research rather than covering architectural design? Please, Professor Willis.
I may need to ask for a clarification. Are we talking about architects who graduate who then become members of the institute or association or who are registered or who count themselves as an architect?
Who registered actually?
Okay. Registration is something that is set up by each country for itself. I know in Australia, they will not accept that research becomes part of the skill set for registration because they are certifying that the person as an architect has competencies across a series of fields, which is why I have chosen not to be a registered architect, but I am an architecture researcher. And my contributions to the profession are recognised by my membership of the Institute of Architects. So I can be a member of the association and they recognise my contributions, but I am not certified as an architect under law. Now, I could be if I chose to go and do that, but I have chosen not to. So in Australia, I have an alternative way of demonstrating my skills and standing in the field of architecture without taking up registration. But in Australia, you do not need to be a registered architect to practice in architecture. You only need to be a registered architect to call yourself an architect publicly. So I cannot put on my business card, I am an architect, because I'm not registered, but I can talk about and I can practice architecture without any restrictions. So this is the difficulty about how do you count who is described as an architect, because of the different ways you can come to qualification in the discipline as opposed to legal registration as a particular definition. I apologize for a complex answer. I'm not sure I have answered your question well, so I apologize for that.
Yes, thank you. Wow, apparently questions are coming now. Initially, it's only few, now many. Okay. Now Comfort, I think there are 3 more questions here. Now is Grace. Grace, are you going to address the questions directly?
Thank you, Ms. Willis. So my question is, Indonesia is a very diverse country. In fact, it is one of the most ethnically diverse. So
Grace, can you be a little bit louder? It is.
I'm sorry. Yes, I'm gonna read it. I'm sorry. Indonesia is a very diverse country, and in fact, it was one of the most ethnically diverse societies. But not all of them are very aware of gender equity. And I came from one of the major ethnic groups in Indonesia, and our culture is based on a very old and very strong patriarchal system. When I was a child, I thought nothing of it, and even back in school and even in college, there is no major red flag that I received for being a woman. But once I entered the working environment for the first time, I finally understand what it really meant to be a woman. It is to be underestimated and to be adopted every single time. So between us women whose life are mostly concerned, these values and movement regarding gender equity may and should be put at the most importance. But for those whose life are basically benefited from this discrepancy between men and women, how could we convince them to support us, especially those who basically grew up from this old and traditional views? Thank you.
It's quite a difficult question to answer. As I said before, there are long traditions that are important as a culture, part of broad culture of society. And I understand why they exist. And there are really important elements to them. But I will say, as I said before, if a certain group of people are making the decisions for all, they will reflect on their own experience, and that is not the full experience of society. So they can only, there will be limitations to what they can do, and over time that may become less relevant as society changes, and particularly as society progresses and becomes more international. So it is important to have as many voices in professions and contributing to decisions as possible, because it will make them stronger decisions and more relevant to everybody who experiences them. It does mean, and how to convince people that this is important, I'm afraid it takes time. It takes time for them to realise that if you are going to take away half of your talent pool before you have even started recruiting because they are female, you're left with only half. And then you might take away more because of other characteristics. You're left with only a small group of people. And while that might work in some circumstances, in a competitive market, it's a limitation. And another, in a competitive market, and I mean like a worldwide economy, talented people will go where there are other opportunities. And if that means going to another place to gain those opportunities, then they will do that in an increasingly mobile society. So you need, perhaps it's my Australian perspective, but we talk about the war for talent, that there are not enough talented people for us to recruit. And so we have to be the best place for you to work with us because we want the best talent. If you don't have that open mindset as to what talent is, you will be very limited. And that's the kinds of arguments that I use when I'm speaking to the university administration and to the profession to say, you're missing out on the best talent if you only recruit this group. You're going to miss out on future jobs because you are only recruiting this small group. You are not making good business decisions because of that. Now, it's a very commercially oriented argument, but that one seems to work.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes. Okay. We come to next questions from Miftah. Okay, Miftah, are you there? Please, Miftah.
Indah.
Yes.
Thank you for the talk, Professor Willis. So there is a community established for women architect and architecture students in my place, or to those who have interest in architecture. It's for empowering women, particularly architects, and accommodate architecture female students. Some activities are open for public, male and female audience, and most activities are open for women only. And this is usually for study discussions, because their sentiment grows from the men architects. So I see there's contradiction here that as a community for women, it's also get demand to be accommodative for men as well. So where is the boundaries that should be placed here? That's my question.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Yeah.
So when I have been involved in groups in Australia about promoting women architects, we have never limited the membership to only women. We have invited male members, and we have had male members, and we continue to have male members, and that they are not exclusive. They're not exclusive discussions for women. They are dominated by women because they are about promoting equity for women in the profession, but they are not exclusive to them. Now, that takes away that argument as to why it's important only for women to come together. Now, there are groups that do want to be exclusive, one gender or the other. And I can understand for cultural reasons there might be a greater emphasis on that in Indonesia as there might be in Australia. But it's really worth understanding that improvements to working conditions in the profession that women might push for, they are equally beneficial to men, and it is important to have them as part of the conversation. That think of it as women-led conversations, not women-only conversations, and that it's important to understand the whole benefits that one can get from thinking about what supports women into the profession itself. So I can't say where the line should be drawn because I think that there are benefits on both sides of that. But I do think that if you exclude men from these conversations, it continues that there are men on one side and the women on the other, instead of architects working together. But that is my perspective.
Thank you, Professor. So much.
Okay. Thank you, Miftah. Okay. Okay, there is still one more questions here. Okay, Nyoman Ratih Praban. Please, Ratih, I think this is to clarify the earlier questions from Rosita. I think Ratih want to be sure whether there are differences between the design approach of between men and women. Maybe Ratih, please. So this is not about professions, but about designs, I think.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. I just want to continue Rosita's question. And what I want to ask is how about the approach? How about the approach? Maybe there are differences in mindset or how to solve the problems or design approach between men and women architects. Okay, I think that's all. Thank you.
Again, I find it a difficult answer to try and give because in my experience, men and women go through the same training in architecture and are taught to think in particular ways. But we all bring our own personality and ways of thinking to that education, and so they will be different. I find it hard to assign characteristics for male and female, and that is partly because when I did my work in history, the history of women architects, when I interviewed them, they told me that they got very angry at people assuming that they were very good at designing kitchens.
Mm.
And some of them didn't cook at all, and they didn't know what a good kitchen was, and they objected to the assumption that because they were female, they were automatically good at kitchens. And I understood that, because you don't want to make an assumption about someone's experience based on their gender, but it may be that women bring a better understanding of a particular kind of space. I'm not sure. I do know that women are very good at multitasking, and they have sometimes they do bring different ways of approaching issues, but they are also enculturated to behave in particular ways. And I can tell you how some of the enculturation of women in Australia operates. I can tell you that women are not supposed to be angry in Australia, but men are allowed to be angry. I don't know whether it is the same in Indonesia. And women are supposed to be kind in Australia. Actually, what I would hope that everybody is supposed to be kind, but we see some of those that come from social expectations about how women should behave that are then brought into their own thinking. And so you may get differences coming from social expectations that come through in design, but I haven't seen it so much. I'm not very good at designing kitchens myself, but I do a good line in studios, for instance.
Okay. Wow. Okay. Apparently, it developed into a very, very big discussions. Okay. Is there any questions? Oh, okay. Apparently, there are still questions. Okay. Now is from Diana. Am I right, Diana? Okay, Diana, please.
Good afternoon.
Okay, Diana.
Yeah, good afternoon. I would like to, I'm sorry. Yeah, I would like to ask about, I'm curious about how female architecture films, they survive during the in between the maternity leave. Is it possible to survive, or as a woman architect, you're supposed to establish a firm after you're supposed to have a family after you have your firm already established, or you should have a firm first before you start a family? Like which is which, or how do you survive from this?
I think over time, women have started firms at all different points in their lives, and it hasn't necessarily been a conscious decision before or after children. Certainly, if you are setting a firm up before having children and you have trusted employees and partners who you can work with, that it makes it easier to take maternity leave. And I know of plenty of women architects over decades have made different choices as to how to manage that juggle between the responsibilities of motherhood and the responsibilities of running a firm. But they have managed it. And we have to remember that the immediate, the period of time in which a child is very small and very dependent on a mother is, in the scale of a whole career, a limited amount of time. It does not mean that they are incapable of designing. It's just that they have less time and energy to devote to architecture for a period of time. And if they are able to get help over time, they can return to very productive and creative periods post having children. So people do it. They do it at all different points in time. It's not necessarily a conscious decision, but they are able to manage it and have very successful careers. And there will be lots of women here today who have done this. And you should take inspiration from the fact that they have children and careers and they are successful and they are here, which is great.
How is it, Diana? Okay. Okay. There is no more questions. Is there anyone want to address the question?
Can I add more questions? Yeah.
Yes.
So, Julie, following your study or research in women architects in Australia, are there any specialization or any tendency for the women architect to do a certain works or type of works, or comes then to a specialization between women and male architect, for example, following from your study, from the data of your study? Are there any tendency of that?
I can't answer that for current architects. I can answer it for architects in the earlier 20th century. There was quite a tradition of women architects becoming specialist hospital architects. Mm. And partly that is about choices that were pushed upon them and assumptions about their that they were good at doing architecture that was a caring kind of architecture. If they didn't want to do kitchens, they could do hospitals with industrial kitchens. But what happened was that as there were a number of successful ones, it brought more women into that particular field. And if anybody is knowledgeable about the design of hospitals, they are enormously complex, difficult projects that require incredible technical knowledge, unbelievably good lateral thinking. They're really challenging for architects. So that women were successful wasn't because they were good at designing kitchens and caring buildings. They were really good at being an architect. So because it's such a challenging thing. But we do see in sort of history a tendency for women to be engaged in a more caring kind of architecture, welfare-based architectures, because that's where the choices push them to do that. That's not so much the case now, and we see women working in almost every part of the architecture profession in Australia, doing everything from tiny renovations through to absolutely huge sports stadia, hospitals, public buildings, urban design. We see women everywhere. So they don't tend to specialise now. They tend to go and do the work they find most interesting.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, this is very unexpectedly very there are a lot of questions, a lot of discussions. I really enjoy this discussion today very much, Professor Willis. Okay, Ibu Roro, so what will we do to after this? I think we have been a lot of this. We have already had a lot of discussions, long discussions. So I think I will return to Ibu Roro. Please, Ibu Roro.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Frida, for moderating this session, and also thank you for Julie again for the thought-provoking presentation, and thank you for all the participants for the vibrant discussion, very fruitful discussion we have today. I think one more question come, but I think
really?
what should we do? Should we address the question first,
Yeah,
or
wait.
because we
No,
still
because
actually
it doesn't
have
appear here. It doesn't appear in my chat room.
Oh no. It's no, it's for me. It's for me. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay.
sorry, I messed it up. Sorry. Okay, because I think because of the time, it's already 2:50. I think we should close this session. Again, I want to thank you for Julie for making time here, and everyone who come. And I would like to remind you all that we will have another guest lecture next time from Alan Pert on Wednesday, 17th of November, 2021. He will talk about design that enhance personal and community well-being. So it will be another interesting topic, and we will circulate the poster soon. And before I close the session, I think we will have a photo session while Julie's here. Danny, can you lead us?
Okay, Bu Roro. Okay, everyone, on your camera for the photo session. Okay, in my screen, I have pictures. Okay, from the first page, 1, 2, 3. For the second, 1, 2, 3. 1. For 1. And it's 1, 2. Roro?
Okay, all good? Jenny? Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jenny, and thank you so much, everyone. I think with this photo session, that marks the end of today's lecture. Thank you for all of you to come, and see you next time. And I close with Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very